I have really been looking forward to this series. The World Spins Madly On Part 2. A year ago, we talked about the life of Elijah, probably the most famous prophet of the entire Old Testament. He passed the mantle on to Elisha. That's S-H-A, not J-H-A. So Elijah gives the mantle to Elisha. And even though he was his student, Elisha asked for a double portion from God, and God gave it to him. He actually did twice as many miracles as his mentor. Now, with both of these series, World Spins Madly On, Part 1 and Part 2, one of the things that we want to kind of clue you in on is how all the stories of the Old Testament, as great as those stories are, they're pointing to something bigger. And that something, you could probably guess, is Jesus. The technical term is recapitulation, where something happens in the Old Testament, and it's incomplete. It's not fulfilled. I mean, it's a great story. There's a lot of great stories. But it points to something even more important, even more satisfying and fulfilling. So you've got this kind of shadow of the Old Testament and the light of Jesus in the New. So let me just process through some of the similarities between Elisha, the student of Elijah, and Jesus. So for example, Elisha raised the Shunammite woman's son from the dead. You know what's on the other side of the mountain, to the little village of Shunem? It's a little village called Nain. And that's where Jesus raised a widow's son from the dead. Elisha fed 100 men with 20 barley loaves. Now, we think of a loaf of bread as pretty big. Think dinner roll. And you might remember that Jesus used 5, and it specifically said in John, barley loaves. This was a little kid's lunch, so 5 little, like mini tortillas is going to be this kid's lunch. Jesus took 5 of those and fed not 100 men, but 5,000 men. Now, you do the math. If one little boy can eat 5 of these loaves, Elisha multiplied it by 25 times. Jesus multiplied it by 5,000 times. Elisha healed Naaman. He's a Syrian commander who had leprosy, terrible disease. Jesus healed a Samaritan who had leprosy. Elisha was confronted by the king of Moab. Jesus was confronted by King Herod and Pilate. Herod was half Jewish, half Roman, and Pilate, of course, was completely Roman. So a foreign king confronted both of them. Elisha had a disciple named Gehazi, who, because of his greed, betrayed his master. Sound familiar? Jesus had Judas Iscariot, because of his greed, for 30 pieces of silver, betrayed his master. So there's some consistent comparisons. What you see in Elisha is fulfilled in Jesus. And Elijah, as interesting as his stories are, they point forward to something greater. And I'm going to show you one little tidbit from this week's sermon to point that out. So here's the text from that we've talked about over the weekend. 1 Kings 19, verse 19. So Elijah went from there and found Elisha, son of Shaphat. He was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen, and he himself was driving the 12th pair. Elijah went up to him and threw his cloak around him. Elisha then left his oxen and ran after Elijah. "Let me kiss my father and mother goodbye," he said, "and then I'll come with you." "Go back," Elijah replied. "What have I done to you?" So Elisha left him and went back. He took his yoke of oxen and slaughtered them. He burned the plowing equipment to cook the meat and gave it to the people, and they ate. Then he set out to follow Elijah and became his servant. So there is this call, the mantle being passed from Elijah to Elisha. And he said, "Can I go say goodbye to my family?" And Elijah said, "Well, what have I done?" "Of course, yeah, go say goodbye to your family." Watch what happens with Jesus. Again, shadow, light, shadow, light. Luke 9. Still another said, "I will follow you, Lord, but first let me go back and say goodbye to my family." Jesus replied, "No one who puts a hand to the plow and looks back is fit for service in the kingdom of God." Now, it may sound like Jesus is kind of bashing Elisha for going and saying goodbye to his family. He's not. Elisha, it was appropriate for him to say goodbye to his family. That's appropriate. Why is it no longer appropriate with Jesus? Remember the feeding, where Elisha multiplied the loaves 25 times, Jesus multiplied it 5,000 times. His life, his ministry is exponentially more important than Elisha's. And as Jesus' ministry heads to the finish line, which is a cross in Jerusalem, there is no time to say goodbye to your family. So one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, are these just stories to us? Or is it pointing to something real and serious and compelling as we chase hard after Jesus? If Elijah required such devotion, how much more devotion does Jesus deserve? And that is something worth talking about.